It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Welcome to the Opperman Report, brought to you by Audible.com. That's right, go to audibletrial.com/Opperman Report and get yourself a free audiobook. You can sign up for free, you get a free audiobook, and pretty much that's it. Okay, so tonight we're live on cjmarsradio.com and 365 Live, hazyradio.com, and tomorrow you can hear us on Para X Radio, Saturday night, 7 p.m., Pacific Standard Time, and then we're rebroadcast throughout the week on awakeradio.us, awakeradio.uk, 1800, Shazaz Radio, Shake and Wake Radio, Firehorse Radio, and WTRU Radio. And don't forget, Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're on Penny Entertainment on blogtalk.com. And, of course, iHeartRadio. You can find us on iHeart and Spreaker and all that kind of stuff. Now, tonight our guest is, we should have some kind of, we need an echo machine. I need a real engineer over here that can hook me up, because we have the historian of the strange. I gotta do it. My own homemade sound equipment here. But we got Robert-damon-schneck. Okay, and he's the historian of the strange. He's strange. He's written all these books about the president's vampire and Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist. Really fascinating kind of stuff. I think he's right up our alley. He has a Facebook page called Historian of the Strange. So you can go there. You should go there right now, as a matter of fact. Go to Facebook, Historian of the Strange, and check out all the kind of stuff, because you can call in throughout the night and ask him questions about all the fascinating stuff that he has on his page. Now, don't forget, coming up next week, we got another fascinating woman. We have the author Leigh Lamb. Okay, and she's from The Curse of Oak Island. All right, very fascinating story about the Oak Island. There's supposed to be buried treasure over there, and Leigh Lamb is like an elder statesman in this area of Oak Island, and all the legends and folklore that go on there, because her parents were originally circus performers. Okay, which is interesting enough. And then they turned into treasure hunters, and they lived on Oak Island for years and years and years, digging up there the whole island, maps and with all the stuff they're doing. There's all kinds of tunnels. It's a crazy story, and hunting for this treasure. So we have Leigh Lamb coming on next week. And then coming up soon, okay, we don't have a definitive date, but this is a big story we're working on. We have Catherine McDonald, who's the wife of Jeffrey McDonald. She's going to be coming on here telling us about all the new developments in the litigation with Jeffrey McDonald. She's convinced that he's innocent of these charges. He's been in jail for prison for 40 years. So she has all kinds of new information that she wants to share with us, and all kinds of activity going on with that case. Stuff you haven't heard before, I'm sure. And I can tell you for a fact, I've spent a lot of time talking to Catherine McDonald. You're going to fall in love with this woman when you meet her on the show. I know you will, because I'm in love with her already. She's an incredible woman. And she knows the case backwards and forward, but just a really good soul. Now, after we do the show tonight, you can find the archives on YouTube. You go to the Opperman Report YouTube channel. Okay, and it would be great if you just went there and subscribed. And then, I don't have to remind you every week. And if you want to find the shows too, there's a couple of shows, by the way, that are on the Spreaker channel that aren't on YouTube. You go to Spreaker.com and you look up the Opperman Report. And also too, on iHeartRadio, go to iHeartRadio and look up the Opperman Report. You can find all the old archives. Keep an eye out for iTunes. Okay, we're going to be putting the archives up on iTunes. And I think there's a way to broadcast live on there as well. So that's coming up, and within the next few weeks we're going to be doing that. But tonight we have with us, don't forget, you can go to the Opperman Report blog, and you can get the links to Mr. Robert-damon-schneck. I'm going to blow that name all night. But I'm going to blow it, man. I know I am. Robert Schneck. Is that how you pronounce it, Robert?
That is how I pronounce it, yes.
Okay, great. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into your books and stuff?
Okay. I have spent much of my life reading and researching about bizarre things. A few years ago, I decided to concentrate specifically on the United States for several reasons. I'm fascinated by this country, and also it's just much easier to carry out proper research in your own country. So I started to write a series of articles for the Fortean Times, a magazine in the UK that specializes in the strange and paranormal. And from these articles, I developed my first book, which was The President's Vampire, a collection of very strange stories that most people had never heard of, or had been completely forgotten, or they were stories that I thought I had something that I could add to that just had never been part of the mix. And more or less the same thing happened with my current book, Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist, which it tends a little bit more towards cult. There's several histories of cult activity, as well as chapters on self-beheading, blood drinking as medicinal blood drinking, some things on Bigfoot and treasure hunting, speaking of Oak Island, a few other chapters that I think your listeners will be interested in, including a chapter on men that screw horns to their heads. And let's see. Oh, well, that covers it very quickly, but there's a lot more in the book.
Well, that's a lot to cover right off the bat. Okay. Yeah. So real quick, let's start off with The President's Vampire. What the hell's going on with that?
The title story?
Yeah.
Well, it started out when I was reading a book that talked about this bizarre crime that took place in the 19th century, where this sailor was accused of killing two of his shipmates and drinking their blood. He was put on trial and found guilty and was going to hang, but the president, who was then Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, he commuted the sentence to life in prison, and the man eventually went crazy and had to go to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And I thought to myself, well, that is an interesting story. I thought I had uncovered, first of all, an historical vampire, and also I thought I had discovered a very early American serial killer. And, there's always this competition among writers to name America's first serial killer. So I began to research the story of this sailor whose name was James Brown. And he turned out he was not a sailor. He was actually
the godfather of soul.
He was that and the ship cook.
Okay.
So this was a multifaceted man. So he was the ship's cook, and he hadn't actually killed two sailors and drank their blood. What he actually did was he got into an argument with one sailor. They got into a knife fight, and he threw the knife overboard after killing this man. That's what actually happened.
So he never actually drank their blood?
He never drank their blood. He never he killed two people. He never did any of the things that, according to the stories that appear in some collections of American vampire history, that he was supposed to have done. He was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to hang, and his sentence was commuted by President Andrew Johnson. But and he did go to prison for several more years, but he eventually went completely insane and had to go down to St. Elizabeth's, where he finally died. The story intrigued me, though, because first of all, I can't imagine how this very ordinary knife fight got transformed into this gothic mystery on the sea. But somehow that's the story that ended up in the newspapers. I have a theory that it might have to do with the fact that in the same year that he was put on trial was also the year that Mercy Brown, the vampire in Rhode Island, was dug up, and her pieces of her body were burned and given to her brother to drink because they thought that she was feeding on his life force. So the only explanation I can come up with is that Mercy Brown and James Brown somehow got mixed up in some writer's mind, and he wrote up this story. 19th century newspapers were notorious for coming up with the most sensational stories they could come up with in order to sell as many papers as they could.
Well, let me ask you a question. Did
Sure.
were you able to get copies of these newspaper articles?
I got copies of the newspaper articles, but I was never able to find the one that I think made the switch that transformed this very ordinary murder into the vampire story. In fact, when you find the very first article to appear on the story in the newspaper is very straightforward. It describes the murder on board the ship and the man being sentenced to hang. That's all it was. But then a few years went by, and somehow this story about him being a vampire appeared. And I think that it might have actually had some results in that we know that Bram Stoker was collecting material for Dracula at this time, and he did collect newspaper articles, and some of them came from the United States. And there is a whole chapter in Dracula that describes Dracula's trip from Transylvania to England, and it talks about him feeding on the sailors one by one. And I can't prove it, but I've often wondered if the story of James Brown inspired that chapter in Dracula.
Yeah, that is very interesting. But that brings a question to my mind. Are you familiar with that story about that there was a Dracula movie where they actually had a real vampire?
Are you talking about the film with John Malkovich?
Oh,
where,
yeah. Then it would be recent. Yeah, then it would be real, right? Yeah.
Right. That's based on the film Nosferatu.
Right.
Right, where the premise of the movie is that Max Schreck, the actor who played Count Orlok in Nosferatu, was really a vampire. But Max Schreck was a real actor. I mean, he was known to. I think he had a long history on the stage. But of course, his name in German means Max Fear, so it seems like something that would be made up and invented. But no, that was his name.
But so then it's not based on a true story then.
No, it's just a movie premise.
Oh, okay, yeah. I never.
It's a good movie premise.
I never quite followed up on that.
Yeah. See, this is how stories get started.
Yeah, I know. People are going to quote me tomorrow.
No, really, it happens all the time. Something will appear in a movie, and it will somehow turn into folklore. I mean, look what's happening with the Slender Man now in Wisconsin. I mean, that began as a work of fiction. It, photographs were made. It's even copyrighted as far as I know, but it's been transformed into a part of American folklore, a part that was convincing enough for some people to commit an act of violence based on it. At least that's the story that we're getting now. But again, that sort of thing does happen all the time, and it would not surprise me if the idea that a real vampire was used in the film Nosferatu acquired some legitimacy over time.
Right. Yeah, before you know it, people will be thinking it's real, yeah.
Oh, it really does. I mean, my first book has a story called Bridge to Body Island, which turned out to be the most popular story in the book. And it's a very spooky story. It involves these three. It's true. I know the people it happened to. It involved these three college students in Wisconsin who had a very boring winter ahead of them, and they were amusing themselves with a Ouija board. Well, the Ouija board began to contact a bunch of spirits, and they gave the usual rather boring spirit stuff about, there is one universal consciousness, blah, 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 blah. But they were also getting hints of something darker, and my friend has an appetite for dark stories. So he wanted to pursue this thing that these board spirits were talking about. And they told him this bizarre story about this a blind albino boy who was born in Louisiana sometime in the 1920s, was abandoned by his family, put in an orphanage. As he grew up, as he got older, he became unmanageable, and he murdered one of the nurses with a pair of scissors and escaped. Now, according to the spirits of the board, he became some kind of a sorcerer, possibly something involving voodoo because it is Louisiana. And people that learned his name would turn into a psychic beacon. So if you learned his name, which if you're curious, his name was the Bye-Bye Man. And as long as you thought of the name Bye-Bye Man, you became a beacon, and he would start to zero in on you. And as he rode around on the railroad cars as a hobo, he would find the people that were thinking about his name and murder them. And he would probably take their tongues and eyes and sew them into this creature that accompanied him called Gloomsinger. Gloomsinger was, again, just a mass of eyes and tongues, and it acted as the Bye-Bye Man's eyes, and it would help him close in on the victim by letting out a whistle. Now, they got all this from the Ouija board, and there were three of them, and one of them she had enough. That was it. She was done with this stuff, and they let the story go. But the two of them began to have strange things happen to them. They were waking up at 3 a.m. They were one of them had a voice that sounded like her knocking on his door in the middle of the night saying she wanted to go out to breakfast. And then he looked at the door, he looked out the window, and it was pitch black. It was the middle of the night, and he could see a pair of dark shadows underneath the door where 2 feet were standing. And he was just so utterly terrified that he spent the whole night on the floor, where I think he finally fell asleep. Then the girl, she was out crossing a bridge by a railroad track when she heard a whistling that no one else heard, and it panicked her and terrified her. Now, the story, it was a good story. My friend used to tell it on Halloween every year. It was sort of a tradition. But I was intrigued by it because doing what I do, I have heard countless stories. But this was the only one that ever really gave me the creeps. So I wrote it down, put it in the book, and now they want to make it into a movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's because it's giving me the creeps right now.
Yeah. It is the creepiest story that anyone has ever told me. Really, I came within a hair of not even including it in the book because it was not a work of history. It was essentially a spooky experience that my friends had. But it was so good, I couldn't leave it out.
Yeah, that is a good one.
Yeah, it really, and again, I was not expecting it to be made into a movie, and that's just crazy.
And the story originates from a Ouija board.
From a Ouija board, yeah.
Okay.
Now, you see, what I find so interesting, and this is why I started to tell the story, is I can very well imagine this story becoming a part of American folklore. It's got all the elements it needs to have, even this bizarre origin. I mean, it was born out of a Ouija board, out of a series of seances that some college students were doing to pass the time. I can easily imagine the Bye-Bye Man becoming a Slender Man, becoming a Green Man, who's another one that's supposed to scare teenagers. But it'll be very interesting to see how over the next few years, if the film is made, because of course you don't know if any movie is going to be made until it's actually released. But it's supposed to come out, I think, next year around Halloween. But I have a feeling that this will become a part of American folklore, which is again one of the reasons why I wrote up the story, because I was just so intrigued by it. It had all the elements it needed.
Now that story as well is in The President's Vampire.
That is in The President's Vampire, yeah.
Oh, brother, what else you got in that one, Dave? What else is in there?
The title of the story is The Bridge to Body Island. Yeah. Body Island is in Wausau, Wisconsin. It's It's a little island in the middle of, I think it's the Wisconsin River, and a railroad bridge passes over it. That's what the girl who heard the whistling, that's what she was crossing when she panicked and ran away. It's called Body Island because lumberjacks working upstream used to drown, and their bodies would end up washing up on the island.
Wow.
Yeah, I lead a cheerful life.
Yeah, that's some incredible stuff. Yeah. Now, does this stuff creep you out a little bit? Because you were saying,
no, it doesn't. It really doesn't. This story creeped me out, probably because I knew the people. It's one thing for me to pull out an historical record, to pull out a census report or a will or a bill of lading or something like that. That just does not carry much impact. But when you've got the person who it happened to standing there telling you the story, it has a very different effect, especially on Halloween when you're surrounded by jack-o'-lanterns and people dressed as witches.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so and the President's Vampire, what else do you have in that book?
Well, that book's got quite a few stories because every chapter usually has several stories in it. I've got a story from Massachusetts that happened in 1692, the same year that the Salem witch trials were underway, and the Salem witch trials overshadowed this, so that they've more or less been forgotten. And it was nearby Salem and Gloucester and Cape Ann. There were some farms that were a little bit out in the country, and they began to be attacked by these phantom militiamen. They looked like French or Indian militia. They looked like perfectly normal people, but when the local farmers shot them, they would fall down, then get up and run away again. They would chase the farmers through the woods. The farmers would chase them through the woods. Sometimes when they fired at them, their guns wouldn't work, their rifles wouldn't work, and it was just very distressing for everyone because it was a period of considerable stress, which might have contributed to the Salem witch trials. The country was it looked like another war was going to break out, so they really thought these were genuine flesh and blood militiamen. But in all the time they were there, and they appeared throughout, I think at least a month through the summer of 1692, they never burned anything, they never stole anything, they never hurt anybody. But they were still being seen, and finally a real militia was called in from Ipswich, and they chased them through the woods, and they were unable to catch them. And someone noticed that when these militiamen, these phantom militiamen, ran over a muddy patch, they didn't leave footprints. So it was finally decided that whatever they were phantoms of some kind, and they shouldn't worry about them anymore. And this story ended up in one of Cotton Mather's histories of the church in the United States. Again, it's a very odd story, but so completely overwhelmed by Salem, which was happening at the same time, that it's just dropped out of the history books. I use that also as an excuse to talk about other what you might call paranormal sieges. I talked about the famous Hopkinsville siege, where a family named Sutton claimed that they were surrounded by little silvery green creatures that might have come out of a flying saucer, and they were terrorized by them for one night, and they finally ran away from the house. And also to talk about Ape Canyon, where a group of miners were attacked by rock-throwing Sasquatch that jumped on the roof and tried to break the door down to kill them, probably because earlier in that day they had shot one of the Sasquatch.
Okay, before we get into the Sasquatch, because I've heard that story about the people that were visited by the little aliens. And they had a shootout. They shot guns at them, right?
Yeah, it's called the Hopkinsville, but it was really Kelly, which is outside of Hopkinsville, and they call them the Kelly Goblins. I really just used it as an excuse to talk about the idea of people being under paranormal siege, with the Phantom Militia as the first example.
Okay, now with the Phantom Militia, now how do you research that kind of thing? You go back and find what kind of record is there of that kind of story?
Well, there is actually a very good record in Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americanus, which is his history of the Christian Church in the United States. Cotton Mather he's famous for he's infamous for his connection to the Salem witch trials, though he really did not have anything direct to do with it at all. He just supported the judges because he assumed they were pious men and knew what they were doing. But the way the records were collected is the local minister collected depositions from the people who had these experiences with these militiamen, with these phantom militia. The minister collected the depositions and he mailed them to Cotton Mather, who included them in his history. There are also more roundabout ways of looking at the story. For example, the man at the center of it, his name was Ebenezer Babson. Now, there are a lot of Babsons in that area. There still are. In fact, there's a famous thing called Babson Rocks in that area, which is a bunch of rocks with cryptic sayings on them. But that's a relative of Ebenezer Babson. But Babson was also known because he was well known in the area because he supposedly killed a bear with a fish knife. And in fact, there's a place called Bear Neck, which is supposedly where he did it. So there are all these little odd side issues that at least confirm the existence of the people and give you an idea of what happened. For example, Babson also got mixed up in the witch trials because his mother claimed that she was being harassed by witches, and he brought in some of the girls from Salem as like consultants, witchfinder consultants, and they claimed that the woman was being attacked by witches. So the witch panic in Salem, Babson was doing his part to get it going in Gloucester too, or Cape Ann, I think.
Well, I guess if they're hiring people as consultants, it's probably has money to be made.
No. I don't think there was any money to be made, but the girls were really enjoying the witch hunts, as nearly as I can tell. They got a lot of attention, they got a lot of praise, and they were able to go crazy and do what they wanted.
Oh, really? Oh, because the girls who got it started, they got popular. They got famous.
Well, they certainly did. I mean, I honestly don't know what happened at Salem. Salem, like a lot of things, Salem is a little bit like Jack the Ripper and Roswell and the Kennedy assassination, in that a big new theory appears every 2 years or so. That's why I kind of step back from explanations and I just try to figure out what happened.
Gotcha. So you're saying that with the right, it's one of those like you said with JFK. That it's just we'll never know.
Well, I don't know. I just know that the people who are really into it have written great big whacking fat books about it, and I can't even contemplate beginning to argue something like that with people who know so much and have so many theories about what really happened that just the prospect of it's exhausting.
Real quick, though, because we're going to take a commercial break in a couple of seconds. Now, that story about the family that was attacked by the aliens and they were shooting at them and stuff like that.
Yeah,
what year was that? The Suttons. What year was that?
It was the 1950s. I can't give you the exact year. I think 52.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure it was 52.
Okay, so you're not an expert on the case, okay? But
no,
the thing
I'm
is,
not.
Right,
I'm not.
But the thing is, because that's kind of because it was before all the flying saucer stories. That came out much later, right? Like 59 and 60, there was stuff was coming out, right?
Well, no, the flying saucer story started in the 40s with the sightings of the saucers flying over Mount was it Mount Shasta? No, not Mount Shasta. Mount Rainier. Kenneth Arnold saw them. Right, and Roswell was 47.
Then it was way later. Okay.
No. Ed, I think you might be right. I am not a UFO expert. I stay away from UFOs the way I stay away from the Kennedy assassination because it's just two big wheels within wheels. Everyone's always suing each other. So maybe Kenneth Arnold was later. Like I said, I would look it up before I would say.
Okay, great. Let's take a little commercial break here. We're here tonight with robert-damon-schneck. And he's has a Facebook page called Historian of the Strange. And we're just touching the surface of the strange this guy knows about here. He's the author of the book, The President's Vampire. Another book called Are You Psychic? But when I tried to find that book and put the link up on the blog, there's like 50,000 books called Are You Psychic? So we're gonna have to find that.
Well, it's a book for young adults or children. It's not a big history book.
Okay.
It's just really a fun book for kids.
And the most recent book is Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist.
Yes, it is.
So we'll be right back. We're going to take a nice little break here, about 3, 4, 5 minutes, and get a drink and stuff like that. We'll come right back with robert-damon-schneck.
You are listening to WCJV Digital Broadcasting, Youngstown, New York.
If you're looking for essential oils, stop by and check out Essentially Tammy on Facebook. She is Young Living Essential Oils Independent Distributor. These 100% therapeutic grade oils help support the body's natural functions. You can click on her website posted on Essentially Tammy, that's T-A-M-I, to see the current deals and check out the benefits of oils such as frankincense, joy, valor, lemon, thieves, panaway, and many more. Email Jocotami, that's Jocatami @yahoo.com, or call 352-239-8546. That's 352-239-8546. Hey, don't forget good old Amanda at Pacific West Bamboo. Pacific West Bamboo, 503-839-8126. You can reach her at demroots@oppermail.com. Pacific West Bamboo, your number one source for timber, construction, and craft-grade bamboo poles, plants, products, and more. They specialize in eco-friendly reclaimed wood products for the home and garden. They're located in Portland, Oregon, servicing the Northwest for over 10 years. They can be reached at 503-839-8126. That's 503-839-8126. Her Facebook page is Pacific West Bamboo. They can and do ship nationwide, and they're currently getting a new line of bamboo flooring, veneers, and laminates made from Guadawa bamboo, one of the world's strongest bamboos, grown and produced and manufactured in Central America using only economically and environmentally friendly practices and standards. Good old Mike Gray at infinityhomeplans.com. Check out Infinity Home Plans and Design Services, your resource for 3D and 2D draftsman services. They offer a multitude of products, including stock home plans, 2D digital drawings, 3D models, renderings, and more. That's infinityhomeplans.com. Hey, don't forget emailrevealer.com. That's my website, emailrevealer.com. And we offer all different kinds of services. Current place of employment locate. Let's say you're trying to locate where your ex-husband or your ex-wife is working so you can collect on child support. You contact us, we can locate their place of employment for you and help you collect on that child support. Let's say you think that your husband or your wife is cheating on you. Give us their email address and we can trace it back to online dating websites and dating services. So we have a multitude of services on emailrevealer.com. Hey, don't forget the New World Mexican Women. Okay, now you just Google New World Mexican Women. You can find their book where they first describe their love letters to their men and their sons and their uncles and their brothers who have traveled from South America to North America to work as migrant workers. But the women down in this town there in Guerrero, Mexico, they want their men to come back. So they've written these beautiful love letters, and they've put them all in this beautiful coffee table book. First, the letters are written in Spanish, handwritten. You can see pictures of the people writing the books. And then it comes on after that, and it's typewritten in English. And then also, too, the second half of the book is teaching you how to make authentic Mexican jewelry from these New World Mexican women. You can find their book on Lulu.com. It's only $19, or you can download the digital edition for free. That's New World Mexican Women, and it's a two-part book where first part is the love letters, and the second part is the making the handmade jewelry, the authentic Mexican jewelry. But you can also contact them, too, as well, if you want to get a deal on wholesale jewelry from Mexico, from these women.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report with Ed Opperman.
Oh boy, welcome back to the Opperman Report. We're here tonight with Robert-damon-schneck, who is the historian of the strange. And let me tell you something, off the air, he's even stranger than he is on the air. Because, he gets a little more stranger when we're off the air. But we got some great stuff going on here. He's the author of The President's Vampire, Are You Psychic? And the Wakeman versus the Antichrist. Now, as we left off, okay, we were about to get into this thing about the guys who shot the Sasquatch and they were attacked by Sasquatch. Let's hear a little bit more details on that.
On what happened in 1924?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the story is pretty straightforward. If you look in the cryptozoology literature, if you look in the books about Bigfoot, any history of Bigfoot will tell this story. And it was simply that five miners were up around Mount St. Helens, and they were looking for gold, and they had found a claim, and they were digging it up when one of them shot a Bigfoot. And that night, the cabin where the miners were staying was attacked, and they threw rocks and tried to break down the door, and finally they drove the miners away, and the miners left the next morning after the attack ended. And that was more or less where the story remained. But in 1968 or so, 67, 68, one of the miners, a man named Fred Beck, he wrote his own memoir of what happened, and Fred Beck tells a very different story. Yes, the story of the attack by the Sasquatch, all that's there, and it's all covered in the first 3 pages of the book. What the cryptozoologists and the people who are really interested in Bigfoot as a physical animal, as a normal part of the North American wilderness, what they leave out are the other 25 pages of his book, where he talks about Bigfoot as being a manifested creature from another plane, where he talks about the fact that the miners were not ordinary prospectors. They found their gold mine using seances, and they contacted a spirit that led them to what later became known as Ape Canyon, and that they were just on the verge of finding gold when the Bigfoots drove them off. And one of the things that I found so interesting about that was it was so similar to traditional treasure hunting stories. There's a long history of treasure hunting in the United States where men would go out at night with a book of spells and a sword and a shovel, and they would try to cast a spell so that the evil spirits that guard buried treasure wouldn't be able to protect it. And what would happen is somebody trying to dig up the treasure would talk, because that was the thing that broke the spell. If somebody talked, broke the spell. And then they were driven away by the evil spirits. Without going into the one-by-one comparison, all of those elements are present in the story of Ape Canyon. So,
okay.
Yeah, it really is it's one of those things where it's, you really have to look at it. And again, it's dull to go over it one by one, the different parallels. But they are really interesting when you look at the story from that perspective. And you can also see why Ape Canyon is not the most popular story among cryptozoologists.
Gotcha, because I've been doing a lot of research on that Oak Island story. And that comes up about how they had these guys, they were kind of con men. And they would come to town and tell people, hey, we can help you hunt for gold, buried treasure, like you said. And then, they would bring them out there, they would do the seance, and then, oh, you blew it. We were just about to find the gold.
Exactly.
Right. And pretty much it was a big scam,
I have a story about that in the President's Vampire. Well, there's a story about that in the President's Vampire, about a con man who was brought into Morristown, New Jersey in the 18th century. And he convinced all the local men, and these were very respectable men and well-off men, he convinced them that he was a sorcerer who could control the spirits that guarded the local buried treasure. They just had to contribute. And they contributed, and they contributed, and they contributed, until he acquired a good amount of gold. And the problem, and he had Confederates dress up as ghosts, and he would have these men, these poor men, he had them performing these magical rituals out in fields in the middle of the night. He would get them drunk and have them march around the field for hours while his friends dressed up as ghosts were screaming out of the woods. Anyway, he terrified these poor men, and then at the end, when they were about to get the gold, he said that their lack of faith had caused the guardians of the treasure to decide not to give it to them, and then he left with all of their money.
Right.
Yeah, and it was just a big con job, and this same guy did the same thing several years later in Pennsylvania. He set up, I think, 2 or 3 of these operations. I guess I guess the modern equivalent would be what con men call a big store, where you set up this very elaborate con. And I think that's what he was doing. In fact, later on in later life, he wrote a pamphlet about it, talking about how they shouldn't have been so greedy.
Oh, really?
Yes. It's arrogant.
Yeah, I know, right? But you know what? You see the same kind of thing today. You know, I got all these this alternative media, people, it seems like they're kind of like just luring people in to scam them out of their money, like with these Ebola cures and all this kind of crazy stuff that we got going,
It always happens. I mean, it's funny. Just the other day, I was looking at some old newspaper clippings about the time Halley's Comet came around, not the last time, the time before that.
Right.
And there was sort of a general panic because some people, well, no, it wasn't a general panic, but there was a low key fear that if the world got caught in the tail of the comet, it could cause disease, it could cause terrible things. And there were people selling comet pills. So you take these pills, which were $1 a piece, and back in 10 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they would take these comet pills, and it was supposed to protect them from the comet's tail.
Well, I guess they worked, right?
Yes, they did.
Yeah, right.
As far as I know, no one died from the effect of Halley's Comet.
Well, it's a funny thing because from what I understand, I haven't been following the news that closely, but from what I understand about Ebola, you either catch it or it's cured by riding a bike in Maine. Is that how that works? I can never quite figure it out,
And I'll bet you can rent the bike at a very reasonable cost.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. Like most of these like urban legends and these kind of stuff, most of it's motivated by money. When you get down to it, people trying to sell books and make up stories and sell those rag magazines and stuff. Like even back in the old days, those penny. You know what I'm talking about, right? Those.
You mean the broadsheets?
Yeah,
in the 19th century, where they would sell like ghost stories, murder stories, things like that.
Right.
Well, those were very popular, and I tell you, if those things didn't exist, I wouldn't have much to fall back on. Those are a great source of material. It is funny though when you look in, for example, at the old copies of Fate. I got started in this when I was, I don't know, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and my mother had a copy of Frank Edwards' book, Stranger Than Science. I don't know if you ever read it.
No.
But it was very popular when it came out, and it was maybe the chapters were 2 or 3 pages long, which made it perfect for my age. And he covered just strange things, flying saucers, famous last words, a whole variety of odd subjects. Most of them were just things he had clipped out of Fate magazine, the back pages of Fate, and put in his book. So, but the peculiar thing about that is, if you really start to dig into some of those old stories from Fate, they were based on works of fiction. But they somehow made that jump. Once they appeared in Fate, then they became history, But they were really works of fiction that got reworked to become history.
Yeah, and you have to think too, like back in those days, if something like your story about the vampire on the ship, once that's reported in one paper, it's not like there's alternative. There's a radio show or someone can come out and say, "Oh no, that's all crap." Once it's there, it's like fact.
Well, usually what would happen, the only real way of controlling that is you would have another newspaper in town,
right,
saying that everything that they said was a lie. But they did that so often that you could never really tell who was lying. In fact, in Mrs. Wakeman, there is in the chapter on people that commit suicide by beheading themselves, I've got another story that I really thought I had found. I thought I had found gold with this story.
Okay.
And it was a student in upstate, I believe it was upstate New York, who had withdrawn from his friends and gotten kind of eccentric. And he had spent several years studying chemistry and mysticism. And according to the story, he had developed a serum or some kind of a chemical that could revive the dead no matter how mangled the body was. And according to the story, which was reported in the newspaper, he had built this machine with a big flywheel on it and axe handles and knife blades, and then he fed himself into the machine so that he was torn to pieces. In great detail, they describe what happened to him. And he left a note with the bottle of chemicals, saying that people should sprinkle the chemicals on his body to bring it back to life. Now, when I read that, I thought, wow, I have got to find out what really happened. Well, what really happened was someone at the newspaper made up the story.
All right.
There were a series. There was a suicide cluster actually going on at the time, but the student they named, he didn't kill himself. In fact, he died something like 7 years later of tuberculosis. I don't know where that story came from, but the reason I found out it was a hoax was another newspaper had called them liars. And they said, that they had contacted the young man. He was fine. And, so that was my only way of finding out that this story did not in fact happen.
Yeah, I tell you that must be a lot of fun though, like going back, and research and then looking for the other, corroborating information or whatever.
Well, it is.
Yeah, that's a
it
real
is
adventure.
fun.
Yeah,
it's fun and frustrating. In fact, I've decided that in my next book, whenever I'm able to write it, there is going to be a chapter on nothing except great stories that didn't work out. Because I've got a filing cabinet full of nothing but these bizarre stories that I have found, but no way of corroborating it. There was another one I have that came from Maine in the 19th century where this family wondered why their cow had dried up. They couldn't figure out if she just wasn't giving any milk. And they poked around in their barn and they discovered that this man was hiding in the hay and that he had been sneaking out and living off the milk from the cow. Now, okay, that's not very unusual, except that the man had no feet. Not only did he have no feet, but they had been crudely chopped off, and he could only move by crawling very slowly and painfully on his knees. Now, how did he get to the barn? Where did he come from? Who was he? No one ever knew because he never spoke. He never revealed who he was. He never revealed where he came from, maybe because he couldn't talk. And the only thing else I've ever been able to find about it was a story that the local poorhouse had built a kind of wooden cage for him to sit outside in during the summer. And that's it. That's the end of the story. Nothing else has come along to corroborate it. Apparently the farm did exist. The people who, it was their family farm, but it was such a common name that it's hard to know if that means anything.
But we know the guy existed because they built the thing for him at the homeless.
They said they did.
Okay.
The newspaper reported it, but another newspaper also reported that student had built that huge device for chopping himself up.
Okay. See, that would be very frustrating for me.
It is frustrating.
Yeah, that would be frustrating because I like to find a solution. When I'm investigating something and going back that far. Maybe that's why I don't do that. Maybe I don't go looking into history that much because.
It's frustrating, but when you find it. But when you find the thing, oh, that's terrific. That is, I'll tell you, one of the biggest joys of my life was when I was researching the President's Vampire, and I actually found the ship's log of the day of the murder, written in the president's, not in the president, in the captain's handwriting, describing what had just happened a few hours earlier, saying that he had put the cook in manacles and he was taking him back for trial. And I still get shivers thinking about that, because that was the Holy Grail. That was the ultimate primary source.
Yeah.
Here was the ship's captain. Here was the log. The fact that the ship's logs had even been preserved, I didn't know. But there it was, and that was an amazing feeling.
Well, listen, don't get me started, because I don't need a new addiction in my life. I'm going to start writing down this stuff. Because I got involved, I'm starting to look into this freaking Oak Island thing, man. And that thing that's a fascinating story. Now, have you looked into that?
No, because it's in Nova Scotia, which is Canada.
Right. And
I concentrate, just to keep myself sane,
right.
I concentrate on the United States.
Yeah, this is like a weird obsession, man. I tell you, yeah. It's a. But now you were saying too how you off the air we were talking about how, we were both kind of talking about how, like we everyone we know is focused on all this kind of stuff, like
right.
all your friends. Why don't you tell that story about how all your friends?
I was just talking about how I've got this Historian of the Strange page, and I like to put stuff up on it every day. And when I began doing it, I was looking for really arcane and unusual stuff, because I forgot that my friends and me, we live in kind of a small world where we all know a lot of this stuff. This is what we do. And that nice, normal people outside of our own bizarre little circle, they don't know about it. So I don't have to find stuff that no one's ever heard before, because stuff that my friends and I take for granted, they don't know. And I'm able to post it because it's all new to them. And it took a big load off my mind too. For example, as I was saying that I've been going back and forth about whether I should post the story about Big-Nosed George Parrott, who was a rustler who was lynched back in the 19th century. And some doctors, they decided to look into his brain to see if they could figure out what caused his criminal tendencies. And somewhere along the line, someone took his skin and made a pair of shoes out of him. And so Big-Nosed George Parrott's shoes are his skin as shoes are now displayed at the local historical society.
Now, how did they get a hold of his skin to make shoes out of it?
Well, they did an autopsy. They looked in his brain, because the doctors at the time, there was a really strong belief, and you'll still find it in some places, that antisocial tendencies, criminal tendencies, could actually be seen in the brain. That there were shapes, there were physical evidence of criminality in brains. And the people spent years looking for it. They've never found it. Not physically anyway. Supposedly they're seeing it now in MRIs and things like that. But so they were poking around in his brain, and I guess somebody decided they would take some skin with them.
Okay, see, I can live with that. Okay, they want to examine his brain. Okay, but we're taking a huge leap here, my friend. Where the skin disappears, and then someone comes up with the idea of making shoes.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
There is a tradition of that, though.
Really?
There are lots of books that are bound in human skin.
I've heard that. Yeah.
And it wasn't that unusual to have executed people made into souvenirs. First of all, there was a long ancient tradition of using the body parts of people that have been executed and the rope for medicine.
Oh, really?
Because, it was believed that, in one of my chapters on medicinal blood drinking, I talk about how since ancient Roman times, at least, that's how far back the record goes, since ancient Roman times, drinking human blood was considered a cure for epilepsy and leprosy. In fact, Pliny the Elder talks about how during the gladiatorial games, Romans that suffered from epilepsy would go right down into the stadium and put their mouths on the bleeding wounds of dying gladiators to try to to try to absorb their strength and their health in order to counteract the epilepsy. And that idea, now you say to yourself, well, that was ancient Rome. But that idea continued until well into the 19th century. In fact, Hans Christian Andersen, when he was a child, he saw a man be beheaded, and the blood was collected in a cup and given to a child who was suffering from epilepsy to drink.
Wow.
Yeah, the most potent human blood was believed to be the blood of virgins, children, or
Oh no!
I was taking a drink.
He's choking on us. Okay, give him some blood. Give him a sip of blood. What are you drinking over there? Come on, man. Are you drinking blood? Are you?
I think it's iced tea.
I don't know, man. That was a very well timed sip right in the middle of your blood drinking story.
But that idea of that health and vitality were portable, they could be passed from one being to another through the blood, is the basis of vampirism and a lot of other unusual beliefs. In fact, there's the chapter in the book, I talk about a Kansas City blood cult that whose members, they were called the Samaritans, and their members would volunteer to give each other blood to drink when they weren't feeling well. And now, while that story, it's unusual, it's nothing that strange, but it led me to discover that in the 19th century, there were Americans all over this country who, when they didn't feel well, would go down to the slaughterhouse and get a glass of hot blood right out of the animal's cut throat, drink it down, and use it to treat tuberculosis, especially tuberculosis, but also just sort of a general weakness, old age, depression, things like that.
Well, let me ask you this, because this whole idea of, blood, the shedding of blood, back to the Old Testament, as the
blood is the life,
right, and also as a forgiveness of sin, and then you have Christianity and stuff like that. So now, what is that? You've searched into this blood situation. What do you find? There seems to be like a history of this. Is there something to it?
You mean, is there something to whether blood is actually it can improve your health? I don't know. That is one of those things, a little bit like Roswell and the others that I was talking about,
right,
where every few years you'll find some expert that will say, well, maybe there is something to it. In fact, very recently, last Halloween, which isn't that long ago, I saw an article where they were talking about how there is a chemical or some thing in the blood of young people,
right,
that is not in the blood of older people, and that if an old mouse gets this chemical from a young mouse, that he'll be revitalized. But again, that is one of those things that gets reported every few years, and I even found some respectable 19th century medical journals where they seriously did consider it.
Well, and if you look, there does seem to be something to that, because when you look at like there's all these stories about the human sacrifice, in cults today, and even like the elites are involved in these cults, that are involved in human sacrifice and pedophilia with little kids and murdering little children and stuff like that.
My own feeling about is that I think it's one of those things that is almost wired into the human brain, that it's probably prehistoric. It's so old, I wouldn't be surprised if Neanderthals thought this way, that there's something about blood which was seen in ancient times as, and until fairly recently, until probably the 19th century, it was seen as not just carrying life. For us, it's a collection of corpuscles, and it's a method of carrying oxygen to the cells, that sort of thing. But for them, it was actually life. It was physically life. If you had a bowl of blood, you had a bowl of life. That's how they saw it. And if it was a bowl of blood from someone who was young and healthy, you had a bowl of young and healthy life. I think that was the way people thought about blood, again, until very recently. I generally think that the most important thing in human history since the agricultural revolution was the industrial revolution, and the fact that it began to change the way people thought. One of the things that never ceases to fascinate me is, look at the founding fathers of this country. These were forward-thinking men of the Enlightenment. That's how we think of them. But the people that they were leading were almost medieval. The people, if you had asked Thomas Jefferson about witchcraft, he would have laughed. But I'll bet all the people around him didn't laugh. They believed in witchcraft and alchemy and magic and magical treasure hunting. That was normal until very recently.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would be willing to guess that there are still places where magical treasure hunting goes on.
Well, no, let me say this though. What about the founding fathers though, like their involvement in like the Hellfire Club and the Freemasons and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I personally think the Hellfire Club was really just an excuse to have orgies.
Okay.
As for the Freemasons, I wish if I knew more about it, I would talk about it with some authority. They were Freemasons. I mean, that we know. Then they were hardly shy about talking about it. There was, around 1830 or so, there was a murder in upstate New York, which was blamed on the Freemasons, and it led to a sort of a panic about the Freemasons that they never really recovered from in this country. Again, I'm not going to really. I don't like talking about stuff I haven't researched.
No problem.
So I don't like to sound authoritative about that. But yes, definitely, the founding fathers were Freemasons. I mean,
now what about the stories you hear about Benjamin Franklin and all those human bones?
Yeah, they did find a lot of human bones in his basement.
Yeah, but that happens all the time, right?
But, well, no, he had a friend who taught anatomy, a man named Hewson. And of course, it was illegal to conduct proper autopsies and to anatomize a body for teaching purposes. So apparently he did it in Franklin's home, and Franklin wasn't there. That's as near. I assume it happened after Franklin had died, but I don't know an awful lot about it. I just know that the standard explanation is that Hewson conducted anatomy classes in Franklin's home. But that was another thing that I talk about in Mrs. Wakeman. Because of some. Here we go again with blood. I have a chapter on the first big clown panic.
Wait a minute. Let's hold off on that.
Okay.
We got to do some more commercials, okay?
Oh, okay.
And then when we get back, I want to kind of get into more Franklin some more too. But then the clowns. You can't beat that. And a clown panic can only be gold, okay? So let's get back after this break, and we'll get back into that. We're here tonight with fascinating stuff, man. I got to tell you, I didn't expect to be talking about some of these things, but here with the historian of the strange, Robert-Damon-Schneck. Check out my blog, The Opera Report. We got links to his books, The President's Vampire, and the other book, Wakeman versus the Antichrist. And we're going to get the link to the other one, too. Already second. We get the link up there soon. I promise you. But sure. We'll be right back after this quick message from our sponsors, all our beautiful sponsors like Amanda from Pacific West Bamboo and Mike from InfinityHomeplans.com. And the Essential Oils, Tammy from Essential Oils, and our New World Mexican Women, too. We're going to have a little break from that. And we'll be back after this little break here with more with the historian of the strange, Robert-Damon-Schneck.
You are listening to WCJV Digital Broadcasting, Youngstown, New York.
You're looking for essential oils, stop by and check out Essentially Tammy on Facebook. She is Young Living Essential Oils Independent Distributor. These 100% therapeutic grade oils help support the body's natural functions. You can click on her website posted on Essentially Tammy, that's T-A-M-I, to see the current deals and check out the benefits of oils such as frankincense, joy, valor, lemon, thieves, panaway, and many more. Email Jocotami, that's Jocatami @yahoo.com, or call 352-239-8546. That's 352-239-8546. Hey, don't forget good old Amanda at Pacific West Bamboo. Pacific West Bamboo, 503-839-8126. You can reach her at demroots@oppermail.com. Pacific West Bamboo, your number one source for timber, construction, and craft-grade bamboo poles, plants, products, and more. They specialize in eco-friendly reclaimed wood products for the home and garden. They're located in Portland, Oregon, servicing the Northwest for over 10 years. They can be reached at 503-839-8126. That's 503-839-8126. Her Facebook page is Pacific West Bamboo. They can and do ship nationwide, and they're currently getting a new line of bamboo flooring, veneers, and laminates made from Guadawa bamboo, one of the world's strongest bamboos, grown and produced and manufactured in Central America using only economically and environmentally friendly practices and standards. Good old Mike Gray at infinityhomeplans.com. Check out Infinity Home Plans and Design Services, your resource for 3D and 2D draftsman services. They offer a multitude of products, including stock home plans, 2D digital drawings, 3D models, renderings, and more. That's infinityhomeplans.com. Hey, don't forget emailrevealer.com. That's my website, emailrevealer.com. And we offer all different kinds of services. Current place of employment locate. Let's say you're trying to locate where your ex-husband or your ex-wife is working so you can collect on child support. You contact us, we can locate their place of employment for you and help you collect on that child support. Let's say you think that your husband or your wife is cheating on you. Give us their email address and we can trace it back to online dating websites and dating services. So we have a multitude of services on emailrevealer.com. Hey, don't forget the New World Mexican Women. Okay, now just Google New World Mexican Women. You can find their book where they first describe their love letters to their men and their sons and their uncles and their brothers who have traveled from South America to North America to work as migrant workers. But the women down in this town there in Guerrero, Mexico, they want their men to come back. So they've written these beautiful love letters, and they've put them all in this beautiful coffee table book. First, the letters are written in Spanish, handwritten. You can see pictures of the people writing the books. And then it comes on after that, and it's typewritten in English. And then also, too, the second half of the book is teaching you how to make authentic Mexican jewelry from these New World Mexican women. You can find their book on Lulu.com. It's only $19, or you can download the digital edition for free. That's New World Mexican Women, and it's a two-part book where first part is the love letters, and the second part is the making the handmade jewelry, the authentic Mexican jewelry. But you can also contact them, too, as well, if you want to get a deal on wholesale jewelry from Mexico, from these women.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman, and tonight we have with us robert-damon-schneck. A fascinating guy. He's a researcher and a writer, and he specializes in strange, obscure, and Fortean American history. He's an author of The President's Vampire, Are You Psychic? And most recently, Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist. And he's a regular contributor to the Fortean Times. And Mr. Schneck also lectures on Strange Americana and can be reached at Historian of the Strange. Historian of the Strange on Facebook.com. You can find him over there. Hey, are you back?
I am back.
Okay, great, perfect.
You need a coffee can or something for that.
What we need a real audio engineer that can put all this stuff together. I just started doing the show, man. I just started like a year ago. You know, I was doing my little PI stuff, all nice and quiet, and then I got involved in all kind of crazy stuff. Next thing I know, I was doing interviews all over the place. Now, before we leave Benjamin Franklin, because now, if we got a guy who's in the Hellfire Club, you know, he's a Freemason, the Lunar Society, right? And all these guys, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, sure, they all were. And then we find a bunch of bones underneath his house. And I believe they're mostly bones of little kids, too.
Well, that I don't know.
Well, that's one of the things I heard. Well, you're the expert on that kind of stuff.
But I try not to embarrass myself and only talk about things that I know a little bit about.
Gotcha.
I know probably less about this than you do.
Okay, because all your friends are all obsessed with these little facts and stuff like that, and they'll get on top of you, right? Yeah.
And that's the only reason I've heard of it in the first place, because a friend of mine was interested in it, and I didn't know about it before then. And again, like I said, I try to stick to things that I've actually researched because it's so easy to make a real boner, you know.
Yeah, but the thing is, oh man, you're bad. You know, man, you're lucky you're not having me throwing tomatoes at you, bro. I'm serious. But the thing is, man, once you hear this, man, there's human bones under Ben Franklin's house, man. You're never gonna forget that for the rest of your life.
No.
Yeah, right.
It sticks in your mind.
Oh yeah, man, forget it. Okay, now, one of the stories you had was about a self-beheading. Now, how do you do that?
Oh, it's not just one self-beheading. It's about self-beheading in general.
Okay.
I came across this story again. I was just poking through old newspapers, and there was I found an old article about memorable suicides, and it had some truly odd suicides. I mean, this one farmer who he got his horse and buggy and he rode them head on into a train and things like that. But then they mentioned a man named James Moon. And James Moon was locally famous around Lafayette, Indiana, as the man who chopped his own head off. And what he did was he had fought in the Civil War, and he had become something of a tinkerer afterwards. He farmed, but he liked inventions. He would fool around with perpetual motion machines and things like that. And he also had a tendency to attempt suicide. He made several suicide attempts. Anyway, he
started getting good at it, right?
Well, he got very good at it. He got exceptionally good at it, ultimately. And somehow he made up his mind that he wanted to be famous, and he wanted to be famous for killing himself. And so what he did was he checked into he took his horse and his wagon, and he rode into Lafayette, Indiana, around 1876. And he had a very heavy trunk with him, which he had carried up to the room. He then ran a bunch of errands. He went to the chemist's where he bought some chloroform, and he went to the hardware store where he bought a broad axe head, and he took that to the foundry where he had some heavy iron plates welded to it. He then had all of that stuff brought up to his room, and the next day he did not come down. And by about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the maid had had enough. She had to clean up the room. So she came in through a connecting door from the next room, and there she found James Moon dead on the floor, his head chopped off, and a gigantic mechanical axe had been built in the room, which he had used to chop his own head off. And what he had done was, in that trunk, that heavy trunk that he had brought up to the room, were these pre-cut lengths of wood, which were all designed to be screwed together, then hinged to the floor, and to form the handle of a very large axe, an axe almost 7 feet long, with that heavy broadhead axe, which he had bought that day, on the business end of it. The other end was hinged to the floor. And he he held it up in the air with a length of cord, which he tied to a bracket that he screwed to the window frame. Next to the cord, he had put a candle, so that would
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was a delayed release mechanism. Oh, thank you. And but he didn't want to just chop his own head off. He wanted to do it in a modern way. So what he did was he anesthetized himself. He put a soapbox on the floor, filled it full of cotton batting, put the chloroform on that, then lay down with his head in the soapbox and strapped himself to the floor and let himself be stupefied by the chloroform while waiting for the candle to burn through the cord, and let go the axe, which chopped his head off. This got a lot of attention at the time.
Well, did he do anything like to catch a mouse too?
No, he was never. No, you'd think that would be a good thing to do, but
Yeah.
He tried to do some perpetual motion machines. Like everybody else in the 19th century, he tried to perfect the sewing machine, but his only real success was in what they called the moon guillotine. And people were fascinated by it. They lined up outside the hotel. They marched up to see the room where it happened after the body was taken out. Finally, the undertaker probably exchanged the undertaking duties for the machine, because Moon left his wife without anything except the farm and a bunch of kids to take care of. So she probably traded it. She probably had him buried in exchange for the machine, which then went on display. In fact, it was photographed. I think it was used as a postcard.
Oh my God.
Yeah, you can find the photograph. It appears in the book Weird Indiana. And it shows the photographer's assistant lying down where Moon lay before the axe fell. And there were some very detailed illustrations published about it at the time, because it was the age of the backyard inventor and the tinkerer, and people were just fascinated by this thing. It ended up probably in the funeral director's attic and might still be up there for all anyone knows. It disappeared. There's a lady I know who's writing a novel based on it, and she's been looking for the machine for years.
Now, did you ever look into other like free energy or perpetual motion machines as well?
I know just a little bit about them. I know that there's a John Keeley. I know a little bit about him, and one of his motors is up in Windsor, Vermont, and I'm going to go visit another writer who specializes in oddities. I'm going to be visiting him probably in April because I want to see the Keeley motor.
And do you think, is it supposed to work?
Well, it's supposed to. I don't know. Again, this is not something I've written about, but
okay.
I do know that perpetual motion was it's a favorite. It's one of those things where, you'll be lying in bed at night and you just think to yourself, well, why? It seems like it should work.
Right.
And, it fascinates people who are inventors. They all think they can get it, but for some reason it never quite makes it. But with Moon,
well, probably because the oil companies come and kill them.
Well, whatever it was, when Moon gave up on perpetual motion, he moved into guillotines, or at least into hinged axes.
Great. Oh my God!
Then the story contains other examples of people that committed suicide that way. There's been in the last couple of years, there's been something called that the pathologists called vehicle assisted suicides, in which a person will tie a rope to an unmoving object like a pole or a tree,
right.
put the other end of the rope around his neck, and then drive away. And
that's a good idea, yeah.
Yeah, it yanks the head clean off. For some reason, this seems to be done mainly by men who are mad at their wives or girlfriends.
Ah.
There was a case very recently, right?
I fit right into that.
I found other examples of people that commit suicide by building guillotines. But one case I found, I I can't believe this, but apparently it really did happen, where a man managed to cut his own head off using nothing but a razor.
Ouch.
Yeah, I can't imagine how he did it, because the human neck is layers of muscles, plus the spine, plus a very cartilaginous, the vocal, not the vocal cords, what is it we breathe through? The windpipe, whatever the name.
Esophagus. Right, esophagus.
Yeah, the esophagus is there too. And it's just, this is a real mess of things.
Yeah.
And this man apparently managed with one good cut to take his entire head off using nothing but a straight razor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't see how he did it, but he apparently did. It would be one of those things, though, where I'd want to find the coroner's report before I said it was true for certain. Again, it appears in a newspaper, so.
Well, how long ago was that? Because that sounds like a murder, that, you know.
1906, I think.
Yeah, that sounds like the kind of thing would be a murder that they just called suicide.
I can understand that, except that, who knows? It was a filler item that was printed for interest. So I would leave it as may very well be a murder.
Right.
For some reason they decided it was a suicide, but I'm certainly open to, I don't have any, vested interest in it.
Okay. Tell us about, is that pretty much everything from the President's Vampire? Or are we
there's
oh
lots.
My God. Okay. What else you got?
I've got, there were, one of these stories that has always interested me was a mass disappearance that took place in Newark in 1978. These 5 young men had been hired to move some boxes that day, by a local contractor, and he dropped them off around 11:30 at night. And they were seen to break up into 2 different groups, a group of 2 and a group of 3. And they went in 2 different directions, and all 5 of them disappeared that night. And they disappeared without a trace. Nothing. They vanished before midnight. They were never seen again. The only evidence that the only thing that happened that might be called evidence, at least that the police released to the public, was that one family member received a phone call saying that the 5 had been arrested and were being held down, I don't remember where, somewhere in Washington. No, where were they being held? I can't remember offhand, but it was a phony call. It was a phony call, and it was eventually traced to Washington, D.C. from the old train station there. But who made it? No one knows. This story has been bothering the Newark police for years and years. They've even had psychics come in to try to help. They never found anything. Not a buckle, not a button, nothing. They even checked to see if the boys had been among the young men who died in Jonestown. They checked to see if they were among Jeffrey Dahmer's victims. Nothing. They were wiped.
Okay, so 5 guys, 1978.
1978, yeah.
In Newark, New Jersey.
Newark, New Jersey.
Who hired them to do this job?
He was a local contractor who the police who has been the favorite suspect for years.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
He was actually tried not too long ago, but the evidence was just so weak that he was released.
Huh. Yeah, it sounds like a kind of organized crime kind of thing, you know?
You know what? The only explanation I could think of was that maybe they stole a car, went joyriding, and it drove into the river or something.
Yeah.
Because there have been several cases in the last few years where cars have been found in lakes and in rivers containing human bones, and they've solved mass disappearances that happened 20 years ago. It's just astonishing that a car can vanish, let's say, under a bridge and just not be noticed for so many years. But I've recorded several cases like that.
Well, they got that silt beneath those bridges, you know. They
Exactly.
can sink, right? They can sink down, yeah.
Not to mention the fact that they're in the shadow of the bridge.
Right.
So it's something that does happen, and it almost sounds like the beginning of an urban legend, you know, finding the bodies of someone 20 years later in a sunken car, but it does happen.
Yeah.
If, you know, do a little search on it, you'll find at least 3 or 4 discoveries in the last few years.
Have you looked into this guy? He's a former police officer, and he's written his books about people that turn up missing at national parks.
You know, I've had several people recommend him to me to look into him.
Yeah.
I haven't done it yet.
Okay.
But I certainly would be interested in reading and hearing about what he says. Apparently, he's got a lot of shows on YouTube, so I'll listen to some of them.
Yeah, we're trying to get him on too.
Polides, is that his name?
Right, something like that. Right.
It's a Greek name, I think.
Right, and he seems to feel like there's a supernatural element to it. You know.
Oh, that might be. I don't know what his theory is. I do know that people can vanish under truly bizarre circumstances. If you go to Historian of the Strange, I've got 2 or 3 vanishings there. What I find so amazing about them, though, are these vanishings where someone will be with a group of people, walk out the room, and that's it.
Right.
They're gone. And there's nothing left. I find that astonishing. It's like there's another story. It's not in the book or anything, but it's just speaking on, this is almost like the opposite of vanishing, where they'll find 2 bodies, for example. There were 2 bodies that were found in South Carolina, I think in the 1980s. And they were 1970s. And they were obviously a prosperous couple. They were young, they were attractive, they were well dressed. They'd both been shot, and no one has ever been able to figure out who they were. They call them the South Carolina Does, John Doe and Jane Doe. So they call them the Does, and no one has any idea who they are. And I find that amazing.
It is amazing. With this guy Pilates, right? I'm sure we're pronouncing his name wrong. I apologize.
I'm sure it is.
But one of the cases he talks about is these group of hikers that were hiking here in Nevada, not too far from my home, and they had folded up all their clothes, and they were naked, and they were running around in a circle, and all died from heat stroke or dehydration. They didn't vanish. They found the bodies. But I know where that trail is, and it's not like a trail.
It's not like deep. It's not deep in the wilderness.
No, I could take my kid 5 years old. My kid, out there and hike back and forth, and with no water.
Any sign of drug use?
I don't know.
Oh, I don't know anything about the case. I do. Someone asked me that I should. Someone asked me to look into the Dyatlov incident. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, what do you got?
Well, I'm sorry.
What is it? No.
Oh, the Dyatlov incident was something that happened in Russia. It involved, again, a group of people that were going. I don't think they were skiing. I'm not really sure what they were doing up in the mountains, but it was some kind of leisure activity. And they were all found dead under very bizarre circumstances. And it's become one of the standard strange stories. I refuse to look into it because I don't know any Russian. And if you can't read the documents, there's no point in doing it. And are really the Russians going to just hand over documents to me? I don't think so. So, it's hard enough getting an American bureaucracy to hand over documents. I imagine Russia would be an experience all its own. But it is one of the most. It sounds similar to what you've described, where it seems like a group of healthy, normal people suddenly go crazy and die under bizarre circumstances.
Yeah, and take all their clothes off and fold it up neatly.
What time of the year did that happen?
It was in the hot summer because I had assumed. Yeah, I remember the story. I saw it on the news, and I remember assuming, oh yeah, you go out there, when you're in your heat stroke, and then you take all your clothes off because you go crazy. You think by running around it's going to cool you off. Running around in the breeze,
Well, actually, I thought you were going to tell me that it happened in the dead of winter because there is something that happens in where people's body temperature starts to go down,
and they take their clothes off too. Yeah,
yeah, I've heard about that, and that's what I thought maybe that was going to be heading. But I've actually gotten more and more interested in these sorts of cases the last few years because they're the kind of things. They're the kind of stories that cops tell each other but don't talk about with other people.
Right.
Because they're just so weird. And, cops like to solve cases the way doctors like to cure illnesses. It's what they do. And this stuff eats at them. And they just, it drives them, they'll wonder about it for years. You know, that story about the 5 boys that disappeared in Newark, the cop who was assigned to that, he never stopped. Even after he retired, he was still looking into the case. He never gave it up. And, it always bothered him because he could never come up with a satisfactory explanation for it.
Now, these disappearances, how many of them do you think are connected to cults?
I couldn't say. Certainly there have been reports of that over the years. In the so many of the pedophilia cases, there have been claims of intergenerational cults and things like that. And there were the claims made in that book, The Ultimate Evil, that tied together Berkowitz and serial killers and all that tied all those together. So, it is certainly, I would never dismiss it. It's something that I would want to look more deeply into. There have certainly been cults in other countries that have done that. We don't even have to go that far. You'll go right across the border into Matamoros, Mexico.
There you go.
There was that cult that was murdering people and using their brains and their bones to protect narcotics trafficking.
And supposedly Otis Toole and that other guy. I
was going to say Lee Harvey Oswald. It's not that.
Not him though.
Oh gosh.
Otis Toole and well, we know who we're talking about.
And Henry
Lee Lucas.
Henry Lee Lucas, right.
There was a Lee in there. You got that right.
Yeah, I knew there was a Lee. There's always a Lee or a Wayne.
Yeah, they claim to be connected to that cult down there.
Yeah, they claim to be members of something called the Black Hand of Death or something like that.
Okay, what do you got on cults? Tell us all your knowledge on cults. What do you got?
Well, the thing I wrote about with cults, I get very specific.
Okay.
I try not to come up with big, overarching theories. I prefer to concentrate on just the theory, just the story I'm working on. So I talked to you earlier about the Kansas City blood cult called the Samaritans, which I have never been able to prove their existence. The story was reported in several papers, but when you go to the St. Louis archives, I spoke to the archivist there, and he said there's nothing on that in St. Louis, and he simply cannot understand how, if it really happened, that such a sensational story could not be reported in the local papers, because there were big newspapers in St. Louis. Again, that's one of those stories that can be very frustrating, because on one hand, every public person named in the story, the police chief, the head of there was something called a humane officer who looked after the welfare of children and animals and things like that. All of them were real. They were definitely existed. But all of the people that were supposedly associated with this cult, I was unable to find anything documenting their existence. Nothing. So, again, what do you want to make of that? One person will look at that and say that it was a newspaper hoax. Another person will look at that and say that the big wipe had occurred, Yeah,
and it's the nature of these kind of cults. They're secretive and they do tend to cover things up, and
Well, it is certainly one of the ways people look at it. Are you familiar with Fordianism and Charles Fort and all them?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I don't read it, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's the idea that everything is a little true, everything is a little false,
right,
and everything is always changing. I mean, that's a way to sum up Fordianism. And I tend to see things that way myself. I would never out and out dismiss the cult explanation, the idea of intergenerational cults. I don't feel that the evidence, I haven't been shown evidence that I find convincing yet.
Oh.
But I'm certainly open to the possibility.
I can invite you to a group. I'm gonna invite you to the Maury Terry group online that Maury Terry runs, with that whole book about the ultimate evil and all that kind of stuff. A lot of really serious investigators in there. You're gonna love it. Okay, but let's take a quick break, another commercial break here at the half hour. We're with fascinating guy, Robert-Damon-Schneck, and he's the author. He's the historian of the strange, the author of The President's Vampire, Wakeman versus the Antichrist. Fascinating stuff, man. A regular contributor to the Fortean Times. Very grateful to have him on our show here tonight. He has a Facebook page called The Historian of the Strange, and we'll be right back after this little break of commercial messages with more of Robert-Damon-Schneck.
You are listening to WCJV Digital Broadcasting, Youngstown, New York.
Welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Don't forget, this show is brought to you by Audible.com. You go to audibletrial.com/Opperman Report. Sign up. You go there, visit that link. You get a free audio book. It's free. Okay, you do that for me, please. Okay, we're here tonight with a great, fascinating guest, man. Historian of the Strange, Robert-Damon-Schneck. I got a lot of links to his books up on my website, The President's Vampire, Are You Psychic, and Wakeman versus the Antichrist. Now, was that like a court trial, Wakeman versus the Antichrist?
Oh, no. That's more of a description about what happened.
Okay.
She was tried, but the story very briefly is this. Mrs. Wakeman was a very crazy old lady who lived in New Haven, Connecticut in the middle of the 19th century. And she believed that her husband had murdered her around 1830, and that after she was dead, she went up to heaven, and God and the angels and Jesus told her that she was now God's messenger. And she came back to life 7 hours or so later after her husband killed her, and she left him to become a prophet. And she would go door to door. She would go door to door in various places in Connecticut because she moved around a lot. She would go door to door in preaching. She would preach her own interpretations of the Bible, which put a big emphasis on the devil having the power of death rather than God. That was her big thing. She was fascinated by that. And she attracted some followers. Now, the problem was that Mrs. Wakeman believed that the fate of the entire human race, plus the universe, depended on her continued existence. So if she died, everything would be destroyed. Everything, the whole universe, the entire human race would be destroyed, and it would die unredeemed, so it would all go to hell. Now, the Antichrist she saw the Antichrist as a kind of an evil spirit, and the Antichrist was going to try to kill her. That way it could destroy the universe and damn all of humanity. So what it would do is the evil spirit would jump from person to person trying to kill her. The first person to be possessed by the Antichrist was her husband when he beat her to death. But he killed her, she said, by driving a flaming stick through her heart. But she lived through that because no ordinary physical kind of violence could harm her. So the next person to become possessed by the Antichrist, well, there were some in between, but the next important one to become possessed by the Antichrist was one of her followers, who after one of the Wakemanite meetings, when she would have her followers come over and they would pray and sing, and she would interpret the Bible for them. And after these meetings, they would eat, and he brought over a pie and some cakes, which she ate, became violently ill, and became convinced that he was the Antichrist, and he had tried to poison her with a magical pie. So this pie, according to her, was filled with platinum and dog's brains and human brains and toad intestines and all that, and that it had almost killed her because inside her body it had transformed into these wriggling creatures that tried to cut off her breathing and that sort of thing. So anyway, the group now became very, very watchful to make sure that Mrs. Wakeman wasn't harmed by the Antichrist. And another one of her followers supposedly became possessed, a man named Justice Matthews, who was nothing as much as known about him except that he seemed to be completely harmless. And yeah, that's really about it.
Nothing's known, but he's innocent.
Well, he was harmless in that he was just one of her followers, something of a non-entity. He worked in a gun factory. That's all we know about him, really. And he was married and had children. And his wife was a much more enthusiastic follower of Mrs. Wakeman than he was. And his wife became very ill in his presence, and Mrs. Wakeman decided that happened because Justice Matthews was possessed by the Antichrist, and it was using its evil power to make those around it sick. And of course, the one it was really after was Mrs. Wakeman. So every time Justice Matthews came with her, she became violently ill. Anyway, it was decided on Christmas Eve Day of 1855 that the group would do their best to drive the Antichrist out of Justice Matthews. So they all came over to the house Mrs. Wakeman shared with her half-brother, and Upstairs, they had their prayer meeting, and she would give her classes. She would explain the Bible, rather. They weren't classes. She would explain the Bible. And downstairs, Justice Matthew was tied up and blindfolded, and they were trying to get him to no longer be possessed by the Antichrist. And he said that he was perfectly happy to not be possessed by the Antichrist, but there wasn't seem to be much he could do about it. Anyway, they yelled at him and they adjured him to give up that evil spirit, and they prayed. But still, Mrs. Wakeman got sicker and sicker and sicker until it finally looked as though she was going to die. And her half-brother picked up a witch hazel stick, and he beat Justice Matthews to try to drive out the demon. And when that didn't work, he took a pocket knife out of his pocket and cut the man's throat so deeply that he almost took his head off. And then he took a fork off the stove, and he used it to puncture the chest multiple times, possibly to let the evil spirit out. No one's really sure. Anyway, the next day, the crime was discovered, and all the Wakemanites were taken off to prison. And that looked like it was going to be an end of it. A local cult had gone a little crazy, and that would be all that was said. But a few days later, a young man named Charles Sanford, who was very crazy too, he had attended several of the Wakemanite meetings, a good many of them, and the Wakemanites thought he was crazy, which, just to put Charles Sanford in perspective, they thought he was a lunatic. Anyway, he was a woodcutter by profession, and he left his house on the first day of 1856, New Year's Day. He left his house carrying an axe, which was not unusual because he was a woodcutter. But when he met an old man named Enoch Sperry on the road, he chopped his head off. And then he went on to the house of another old man named Ichabod Umberfield and chopped his head off. And about that time, after he chopped the second old man's head off, they began to realize something was going on, and the neighbors chased him down with the local town constable and dragged him off to jail. They beat him down with some clubs and took him off to jail. Now, even though he was blatantly insane, he was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. They think it might have been because Enoch Sperry, his first victim's son, was a very important official in Connecticut. At least that's what the rumors were at the time. But before they had a chance to hang Charles Sanford, he died of tuberculosis in prison. Now, as for the Wakemanites, they were all released except for Mrs. Wakeman, her half-brother, and one other follower. And they were put on trial. There was a formal trial, and after they had a number of people testify, the prosecutor said no. He was perfectly willing to go with the defense that they were insane. So
So they had an insanity defense back in the 1800s?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, they had the insanity defense, and that was what they were claiming. There was really no way they could do much else. And Mrs. Wakeman was very clearly crazy. She was an intelligent woman, but she had gotten worse over time. She was deeply paranoid. She believed that everyone around her, except for her own very tiny group, she believed they were all enchanters and that they were casting evil spells on her and trying to kill her and her followers. So they pleaded insanity, and everyone went along with that claim. No one contested it. So she and her brother were taken off to the Connecticut State Hospital, where they spent the rest of their lives. She didn't live long after that. And the third lady was a charitable man let her live in his house, so she died soon after. Mrs. Wakeman died soon after. The brother lived a few more years. He became convinced he was the prophet Elijah, and then one day he stopped eating and drinking and starved to death. But and that was more or less the Wakemanites. And the interesting thing about them was that for about 100 years in the United States, the term Wakemanite was used to describe a dangerous religious fanatic. It dropped out of use only in the 1950s. That's how long that the name Wakemanite lasted. And of course now it's completely forgotten, but now the idea of 3 people being killed in a cult related incident after something like Jonestown and the Mansons and Heaven's Gate and Aum Shinrikyo with the, nerve gas on the Tokyo subway, it seems so modest that it's easy to see where the memory of it would just be washed away. I started writing about it, though, because I watched this article called I watched a documentary called The Manson Women, where they concentrated on the women that had carried out the murders and the Tate LaBianca crimes. And they concentrated on them today and, them at the time. And one of the journalists they spoke to said that the Manson family was America's first real cult and that the Tate LaBianca killings were America's first cult killings. And I just knew that that couldn't be right because America has had so many crazy cults, especially in the 19th century.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I found that not only the Wakemanites, the three murders with the Wakemanites, I found a group down in Arkansas called the Cobbites, who had chopped off the head off a skeptic and they stuck his head on a fence post. And I found another group out in Pocasset who their leader had murdered his little girl because he believed that God wanted him to sacrifice her the way Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and a couple of other very odd little stories. So the idea that Manson was the first cult or that the Tate LaBianca killings were the first American cult killings was just very far from accurate. But it's not unusual. I mean, somebody once said that you shouldn't become an historian unless you can imagine that your grandparents actually had a sex life. Really, and it's true. You have to accept the idea that everything did not begin with your generation. Almost everything has happened before. It's just happened in slightly different terms. And I think for someone like this lady I'm sure she's an extremely intelligent and very well-informed journalist, but for her, life began in the 1960s or the 1950s, and so, of course, the first cult was Manson.
Yeah, I got you. Now, when you were researching the Wakemanites, how'd you find that information? From newspaper accountings or from?
It was a combination of things. It was newspaper accounts, and also the local historical society had a good collection of articles, books. There were no books, no whole books on the Wakemanites, but there were several books that made reference to them. Also, again, the term Wakemanite was used for a long time afterwards. So if I would do a word search, I would find several unrelated articles about for example, a later cult would be compared to the Wakemanites because they were led by women and there was the possibility of violence. So they would be compared to them. And again, like I said, that the Wakemanites appeared in the American Encyclopedia until the 1950s. That's how long they remained in the American consciousness. And apart from that, they've been almost completely forgotten, except right in the area where it happened. And the road where Ichabod Umberfield's house once stood. Ichabod Umberfield was Charles Sanford's second victim, the second man to be beheaded. And the house the street where his house stood, a different part of it, but still the same part of the same road, is believed to be very haunted. It's the local spook road. It's supposed to be haunted by monsters and cannibals and ghosts and demons, but it could be that the story that underlying it all was this genuine murder that happened back in the 19th century. Now,
was it common back in those days for women to lead cults?
No, the idea of a woman being in a leadership position in any religious kind of group was considered very questionable.
It's heretic, yeah.
I mean, there were women. I mean, that was actually one of the things that was one of the big appeals of spiritualism, in that women were often the leaders in the spiritualist movement. Women were the mediums. Women led the groups. So it was part of that. I mean, the idea of a woman taking an active role in leading a religious group was pretty questionable for that period. So that was part of why they found the Wakemanites disturbing.
That's just fascinating, man. So listen, we're coming to the end of, we're about to drop off Hazy Radio. And we can go on. If you want to keep going, we can keep going to the after show.
My throat can hold out for a while.
Okay, good. I was hoping you could, because I'm sure we'll be. But what do you want to leave us before we drop? And we got like 7 minutes left before we're down to one station. We're going to drop the other station. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you really want to get out?
No, not particularly. I just think that I think your listeners would enjoy my books. Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist is available. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the normal venues. I think you'll enjoy The President's Vampire too. If you want to read the whole story of the Bye-Bye Man, that's in there. And if your kids are into ESP and things like that, they might enjoy Are You Psychic? Also, if you write to me on the Historian of the Strange page, I'll be happy to say hello, and I hope you sign up for it because I've always got something interesting posted there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. On Historian of the Strange, there's all kinds of pictures and stuff that you wouldn't believe. Like there's this one picture I was looking on there about all the items that were found inside a woman's body.
Yeah, it was 1,400 items were found in the stomach of a woman who was in a Midwestern mental hospital. She was suffering from something called pica, which is this condition where people eat inedible objects, and she was a metal eater. There were countless safety pins, paper clips,
big
nuts, bolts, buttons. I mean, how she lived as long as she did, I can't imagine. Finally, apparently, some of the things she swallowed ruptured her stomach, and she died on the table. And when they were trying to save her, and they found this pile of stuff, and it was arranged into a decorative pattern.
Yeah. Who thinks of doing that? Well, let's take our time,
right?
Just fascinating, man.
Yeah, so it's in a frame and it's on display at the Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri.
Now, have you had a chance to visit all these museums and stuff too?
Oh, I wish I could.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Some I have, some I haven't. For some reason, museums that I visit have a nasty tendency to close shortly afterwards. I don't know why that is. I visit. You ever hear of Jean Dixon?
The psychic?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I visited her museum, closed. She used to have a nifty museum in Virginia that was mainly all of just the stuff that a rich lady accumulates, plus all of her crystal balls and all those sorts of things. But she was a member of the Washington D.C. elite, so there were pictures of her with Tip O'Neill and
really?
Bushes and all of these people. Yeah, every major politician of the period. So it was a lot of fun going through her museum, but eventually it in fact, I wrote a chapter about her in Mrs. Wakeman, where I reviewed her biography because, did she make stuff up? She was a terrible liar.
Yeah.
She lied about everything. And so I critiqued her bio and wrote a bit about her. But that's more or less, that's just one of the many, many stories in the book.
Yeah, I've been to the Liberace Museum, and that's closed now. And
that's too bad.
I know, right? Can you imagine?
Isn't that Las Vegas's only museum?
No, we got the classic car museum, we got the wax museum, we got the mob museum. We got museums here. We got museums coming out of our butts here in Vegas. Okay, anything, forget it, man. They love to promote that kind of stuff. But we're here tonight with we come to the end of the show with robert-damon-schneck, and a fascinating guy, man. Historian of the Strange. That's his Facebook page. Everyone should join up there because there's all kind of great pictures on it, all kinds of great, incredible stuff. But also, too, if you want to get his books, you go to my blog, The Opperman Report. There's links to his books. Fascinating guy. Hopefully we'll have him back on again. I'm going to invite you to that group, too, with the Maury Terry Ultimate Evil book, man, Facebook page.
Well, I'm certainly be interested in seeing some of those material you talked about.
Yeah. I think you will. I talk about strange, man. There's a lot of strange stuff. It's all the same kind of people. You'd get along with everyone there. So, we're all into this same stuff here. So we're going to take some calls. If you want to give a call here to Robert Schneck, you can Skype me at ed.opperman. or the phone number is 702-605-4894. Give us a call. We're still taking calls in a couple of minutes. We're going to leave Hazy Radio in a minute. I want to thank Scott Hare, who's one of the coolest guys around. And thank you, Scott, again for producing for us over there at Hazy Radio. I want to thank Cindy Jean-Pierre, the owner of CJ Morris, and Francis, my producer. All of our producers, Keith Davis and Christoph Moses, and what's his name? Keith Davis, Christoph Moses. Patrick Ian King, another one of our producers, and also to Bailey, who's been helping me out all week long. Great kid. Thank you very much for all your help and being so good and all that kind of stuff like that. Thank you very much. And we're going to be right back after this break with more of Robert Schneck. I'm sorry, brother.
It's okay.
I haven't eaten, man, since
That's fine.
I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning to get my car fixed and stuff. But thank you, Hazy Radio. We're going to see you next week. We got Lee Lamb coming up with the story of the hidden treasure there on Oak Island, and then after that, we got a whole bunch of shows coming up with about the Jeffrey McDonald. And of course, we got Bobby Seale coming up. I got a story too about these Cuban guys who got busted here in the United States. It's a really big story coming up. I have not heard of it before, but we have a big show coming up on that as well. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back after this.